everybody. Today we're going to be learning how to paint marble. The marble we're going to paint is a green, black, and white marble, which is a very popular marble. And understand that these techniques can be modified and applied to paint just about any type of marble. Now the veining will vary from style of marble to marble, and obviously the colors will differ, but the ideas are pretty much the same. Our first step is we're going to base paint our flat. In this case, I've painted it an emerald green right out of the Roscoe Off-Broadway collection. While that's still wet, I'm going to take black, and with a 4-inch laying brush, I'm going to lay in these sort of stripe things, which you'll see here. They're very non-patterned and sort of random, and then we're going to blend those in, but we don't want to over-blend them. We don't want them to disappear. We want to actually still see that there are sort of stripes and patterns in the marble. If we're doing a wet technique, we're going to go ahead and very quickly, we're going to go ahead and start to lay in the veining. And before we start to do that, I think it's important that if you understand how marble is formed in nature, it makes painting it much easier. Marble is essentially rivers of stone. That's what the veining is. When marble was formed, it was all molten rock. And as some of the rock started to cool, other types of rock, which had a lower melting point, would flow through and sort of create these rivers. And that's what we see in the veining. So as we paint our veins, it's important to think about that in terms of river. They branch out and then they reconnect. What they don't do generally is stop and start. If you look at real marble, you might see a place where the vein appears to stop, but understand that you're looking at a slab of marble, and that river, that veining, that river of rock may have taken a turn and turned in a different direction, and that got cut off when the slab was cut. But for the most part, you don't see starting and stopping very often in veining, so you should try to avoid that when you paint your veins. In a wet technique, we're going to let this base still be a little wet. We keep a spray bottle around. A spray bottle is great to help sort of fan out and soften some of these edges, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We're going to take our 1-inch fitch, and we're going to take some white paint, and we're going to start to lay in our veining. An important thing to remember when you're veining is that everybody wants to for some reason, paint the veins at a perfect 45-degree angle. That's not really very accurate, and that's not how they cut marble. So you want to do a much lower angle, so maybe a 30-degree 25-degree angle, so it'll look much more realistic than that classic sort of 45. That's a amateur mistake you'll see very often in smaller theaters or community theaters. So we start to lay in our veining, and we're going to do that with a 1-inch fitch, and we're going to twist and turn and be very loose and free and let it sort of come and go. It's all right if it starts and stops a little bit, as long as it just doesn't. It's not, as long as that vein is still sort of visible, that it's going through, that it's a continuous line. And we're going to lay that in, and I said to do it with a 1-inch fitch. My actual preferred method is to use a turkey feather. My dad used to be an avid turkey hunter, and every year he would cut the wings off a turkey that he had shot, and he would put them in a mailer and mail them to me, little to the post office's knowledge. But unfortunately, my father's not with us anymore and hasn't been for quite a while, so my access to turkey wings has been greatly limited. And we're going to let this veining dry out, whether we're doing a wet or a dry technique. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our white again, and we're going to add in what my scene painting professor would call zingers. And those are really hot spots of white randomly placed throughout the veining. It's going to create some visual interest. It's going to look like the stone. That veining is a little more dense in some areas and less dense in others, and really sort of pop it off the flat. And then we're going to repeat that exact same process, and we're going to do that with black, except much, much more sparingly. We're just going to come along little places along the veining and just sort of punch them with a little bit of black. And again, that just creates some visual interest. You need to remember that we are not faux painting here. This should not look exactly like marble close up. We're painting for the stage. It's going to be under a lot of light, and there's going to be a great deal of distance usually between our painted surface and the audience. Optical blending will go on. If we faux painted and we painted something that looked beautiful like marble right up close, by the time you put it on stage and you had all that distance between the audience and the painted surface, it would really just blend into mud, which is why this technique is a little bold, as is almost all of scene painting. Of course, we can adjust our technique to the size of the space, but for the purposes of this course, we're really painting for sort of a medium-sized proscenium house. The last step in this process is everyone's favorite paint technique, and we are going to spatter, and we're going to spatter with both white and black. We're going to start with black. We always spatter from dark to light. If you want to soften things a little bit, you can mist the flat with a spray bottle. You can also do that when you're veining too. If you find that when you're veining, everything seems a little hard and a little hard-edged and a little consistent, you can take a spray bottle and very judiciously sort of mist it along that vein, and what it'll do is cause that paint to feather out a little bit and soften it a bit. So all we have to do now is we're going to spatter with black, and we're going to spatter with white. The difference between spattering marble and when we spatter other our other projects is that we want this to be a bit more random, whereas we always look for sort of even coverage with the spatter and the bricks and the cinder blocks. In this particular project, we don't want it even. We want it to be heavier in some places and lighter in others. Again, it's going to add to that variation. That visual variation is going to make it a lot more believable. Once this is all done and dry, you can then go ahead and put a matte or a satin, or maybe, God forbid, even a semi-gloss polyurethane. Although the glossier you get, the worse it will look at some point, because the lights on stage, especially if it's a vertical surface or a horizontal surface, you're going to get so much reflection that you actually stop to be able to see the technique underneath. So I prefer a matte or a satin polyurethane to sort of push and pull those colors and really make this thing pop. If you look at this finished flat on the screen, you'll see that the veining on the bottom is a little bit more pronounced than the veining on the top half. And that's because the bottom half of this flat was done a dry technique, which sometimes we're asked to paint marble on a vertical surface, and it's very difficult to do a really, really heavy wet technique. So what happens is we can probably do the wet blend okay vertically, but we have to let that dry, and then we can come back with the white, and I have a tendency to thin that down, make it a little bit more of a wash, but you can't get that nice soft blending that you see in the above with that dry technique. And even if you layer and layer and layer wash after wash, and that's very time consuming. So the two difference between these two is just showing what happens if you do a wet technique versus a dry technique. But other than that, the steps are all the same. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we paint marble. A quick addendum here. If you find when you're painting your veining that it's becoming very patterned or consistent, a really interesting way to try to break that up is, if you're right-handed, is to put the brush in your left hand and paint the veins with your left hand. Most people have a lot less control with their non-dominant hand, and it makes things a little bit easier. So again, if you're having trouble, switch hands. Thanks.